Hi, welcome to Rules Challenge. My name's Carter Maxwell, and in this episode we're going to be taking a look at the game Scythe from Stonemaier Games. Now, in case you're new to the show, this is basically just a test of your understanding of the rules of the game. I run through a series of moves in a real game situation, and periodically I'll just stop and ask legal or illegal, and then I'll go on to give some explanation. If you're a veteran of the game, you can pretty much treat this as a puzzle to solve, like doing the daily crossword, seeing if you can spot the mistakes that are made. But the real focus here is on players who are new to the game. All the examples are meant to show things that people genuinely tend to misunderstand or just forget and play wrong during the course of a game. Just to give you some idea of the state of the board for the first question, we are already well into the game. A lot of rounds have been played, and so you'll find that mechs and resources and buildings are already well established out on the board. And now it's Crimea's turn, so we'll go ahead and start with her. Crimea wants to do a move, so she'll move her action pawn, and she has upgraded it, so she gets to move 3 different pieces. For the first of her 3 allotted moves, she'll move her character over to the village with the encounter token. Then she'll move her mech from the mountain space to the farm and bring 2 workers and a food and 2 wood along with it. Checking her faction mat, she's unlocked Riverwalk for farm and tundra territories, and she's unlocked speed. So she's going to use speed to continue with the mech, dropping everything else off and using Riverwalk to cross over from this farm space into the village. She's fine with how everything else is positioned, so she's just going to skip her 3rd allotted move. Since her movement's done, she needs to resolve this encounter, so she'll remove that encounter marker. She'll draw an encounter card, and one of the options here is to pay 4 coins to deploy 1 mech. So she'll go ahead and pay the 4. She'll choose her Wayfarer mech, and she'll put it into the space where the encounter occurred. And then she'll put that encounter card to the bottom of the deck. Crimea also announces that she's going to do a bottom row action. She's upgraded it so it'll cost her just 2 wood to do a build, and she'll get 1 coin out of that as well. She'll spend 2 wood from the farm space with 2 of her workers, and then she'll place her monument in the tundra space with 3 of her workers up here. So she'll gain the 1 coin for that. And that wraps up Crimea's turn. There are a few things that I think are worth talking about on this move. Let's start with what was illegal. That was when Crimea moved from a farm territory over a river to a village territory. For the Riverwalk ability, people often just focus on the image and think, oh, yep, I can cross at farms or tundra. But the wording is specific. Move across rivers to farms and tundra. It doesn't matter what kind of terrain you're crossing from, but you need to cross to one of those 2 types. In this case, Crimea moved from farm to village, which isn't allowed with her Riverwalk ability. Now it turns out that there was a legal way she could have gotten the mech up to this space. She could have moved from the mountain, crossed the river into tundra, and then used her speed to move over, but then obviously she wouldn't have been able to drop all these pieces off in the farmland along the way. I should mention that dropping off the workers and resources was okay. When your mech has unlocked speed and they're moving multiple hexes, you can drop off workers or resources after the first step and then continue on from there, or pick them up and bring them with you for the second step. The last thing I wanted to talk about is how people will sometimes misplace items they get from an encounter. So we had an encounter take place here, then Crimea paid 4 coins to get a mech, and people will sometimes instinctively place that mech according to the normal placement rules for mechs, which means it has to go with a worker. But when you gain the mech or any kind of resource from an encounter, it has to go in the space where that encounter occurred here. So it was not only allowed that Crimea placed the mech here, she had no choice but to put it in this space. Moving on to Saxony's turn, he also wants to do a move, so we'll move his pawn over to that column, and he's also upgraded it so he can move 3 pieces as well. Alright, Saxony wants to make use of one of his mech abilities here, and you probably can't see it from this angle, so I'll read it to you. Move between any mountain you control and any tunnel. So he's going to move his character from this mountain space he controls up to the tunnel space here controlled by Nordic. Then he'll do basically the same thing with his mech here. He's going to leave behind these 2 resources, but he'll bring the worker with him up to that same tunnel space. And then for his third move, he'll move this worker along with this oil up to that mountain space. Now that movement's done, we need to resolve combat, and Saxony's going to make use of another mech ability. That's Disarm, which says before combat on a territory with a tunnel, opponent gets -2 power. So we'll reduce Nordic's power from an 8 to a 6. The 2 sides reveal their combat power. Saxony has spent 4 power and played 2 combat cards for 5 more for a total of 9. Nordic spent 5 power and played 1 card for 5 for a total of 10. So Nordic wins 10 to 9. First we'll mark off their power expenditures. Saxony spent all 4 of his, so he'll go down to 0. And Nordic spent 5 of his 6, so he'll go down to 1. Then Saxony has to make his retreat. So he'll retreat his character, his mech, and his worker to the home base. And as the loser there, he'll draw a new combat card. And then to wrap up that combat, Nordic will place a star for that combat victory. Saxony doesn't have enough resources to take a bottom row action, so that'll end his turn. The main thing I wanted to show here is that the defender is never penalized for making an attacker's worker retreat. So even though Nordic had forced a retreat of the Saxony worker, he didn't lose a popularity point for that. Another thing that's worth talking about here is Saxony's underpass ability. Now he did use it correctly in this case where he moved from a mountain he controlled to a tunnel that Nordic controlled in this case, but you don't have to control the tunnel side of the move. It's not clear from the faction mat, but also the rulebook mentions that you can move from a mountain you control to another mountain you control. So let's say you had a mech here and wanted to move to this mountain space over here. That wouldn't be allowed because Saxony only controls one side of it. But let's say he had control of the other mountain, then that move would be legal. Now it's Polania's turn, and she also wants to make a move, so she'll move her pawn over to that column. And she's also unlocked a third move, and she also happens to have her mine built. She's only got 1 mech built. She doesn't have Riverwalk unlocked, but she does have speed unlocked. All right, this is going to get a little bit messy. For the first move, she's going to move the mech to the space, the forest space with the mine, bringing all 3 workers and all 3 resources with. She's going to leave behind these resources, but continue on through the mine using speed to get to this tunnel mountain space. So take the mech, take those 3 workers, plus the one that was already sitting in that space, bringing all 4 along to that mountain space. For the next move, she'll do essentially the same thing with this worker. Move up to the forest space with the resource, drop off the resource, move through the mine using speed, but go to a different tunnel space, this time going to the tunnel space here with the Rusviet mill. Then for the third move, she'll move her character through the mine to this tunnel space down here with the Rusviet armory, then use speed to continue on to this space with an encounter token. Now that her movement's done, she needs to resolve the encounter, so she'll remove that token from the map. She'll draw a card, and she'll just take the first option here, which says gain 2 coins and 1 popularity. So she'll take those coins and the 1 popularity. Now Polania announces that she's going to take a bottom row action. She wants to enlist, and she's upgraded it so it'll cost her 2 food. She'll spend 2 food from the space with the mine. She'll gain the 1 coin for having done an enlist. Then she'll take her recruit token from the deploy space, move it up to the one-time bonus of 2 combat cards. So she'll draw those cards. Polania has now enlisted all 4 recruits, so she has to place a star, and she'll put that in the enlist column. Looking around to see who gets the enlist bonus, Polania had it. Nordic, I'll get a combat card. I packed a lot into that example. Hopefully it wasn't overwhelming. There's a lot to talk about, but let's talk about first what was illegal there. When the mech moved from this farm to this forest, then through the mine using speed to get to this tunnel space, that was fine. When the character did it, moving from this space to a tunnel, then continuing on using speed, that was fine as well. The worker, though, can't use an ability unlocked by a mech on their own. So when this piece moved from this space carrying wood up to this mine space, they'd already used up their entire movement allotment. They weren't able to use the speed ability to continue on to another space. But keep in mind that it was just the use of the mech ability that made that illegal. A worker moving through the mine or moving through tunnels isn't by itself illegal. They don't need a mech to carry them to move through their mine or a tunnel. Also, I should mention that it was fine that the worker moved into a space occupied by an enemy structure. I mean, ignoring for now the fact that moving that extra space was illegal, just moving into enemy occupied or spaces occupied by enemy structures is not illegal for a worker. Now, if there were an enemy worker there or mech or character, then that couldn't be done by a worker on his own. But since it was empty other than the structure, he can march right in. Another thing that sometimes seems off about that move to people but is okay is the fact that resources were spent from a space where there wasn't a worker, there wasn't a mech, there wasn't a character. But you don't need your units there to spend the resources. All you have to have is control of the territory. And having a structure there is enough to control it. So it was okay that Palania spent 2 food from this space that only had the mine in it. And then the last thing I'll mention here is that sometimes people will think that when the character moved into this space where there was an enemy structure, that would have interrupted her movement. But no, she's able to continue on, if there's just a structure there, into another space. Now, if there had been any worker there or mech or character, then that would have been enough to stop her movement. All right, now it's Nordic Kingdom's turn, and this one should be a lot simpler than the last one. He wants to do a produce, so he'll move his pawn over to that column. Then he needs to pay a power and a popularity. He has just enough power left to do that. And he's getting low on popularity, but he can handle paying that as well. He has not upgraded that ability, so he gets to produce on 2 territories, but he does have the mill in play. The first territory he wants to produce on is this farm here that has 2 workers, so that'll produce 2 food. The next one he wants to produce on is this tundra that has 4 workers on it, so that'll produce 4 oil. Then he's going to use his mill to activate this territory for production, so that'll produce 2 wood. He doesn't have enough food yet to take a bottom row action, so that'll end his turn. Initially, when Scythe was released, the mill had to be the most misunderstood thing in the game. Current versions of the rulebook make it much more clear, but I wanted to include an example of using it correctly in case somebody has an older edition of the game and is really confused by it. The mill has a dual function. And this part I think most people understand pretty readily. That if this territory is producing, then you get 1 for the worker, 1 for the mill, and basically that it works just like another worker. The second function of the mill, though, is the one that's commonly overlooked. It allows you to activate for production the territory it's in. So in this example, Nordic was allowed 2 base production actions, and so he allocated those to the tundra and to the farm. Then he was able to activate the territory with the mill, thus giving him a 3rd activation, or 3rd production in this case, and then that mill territory produces, so both the worker and the mill produce to give him 2 wood there. Note though that you can't activate the forest space twice. If you activate the space with the mill with one of your regular activations, you don't get to do it a second time using the mill's activation. Alright, moving on to the Rusviet player's turn. She's the only one with a factory card so far, and she wants to use it, so she'll move her pawn over there. She has to pay a combat card to activate that top row action, so she'll do that. And she gets to gain 2 popularity. Now she wants to use the bottom row action that's got 2 move icons. And she's got the speed ability. She's going to make use of that. She's going to move her character to this tundra space and then use speed to continue on to this tundra space occupied by Crimea. Then for her other move, she's going to move her mech same way into that same space. Now that the movement's done, they need to resolve the combat in the space. Rusviet will get to spend 2 combat cards and Crimea can spend 1. Rusviet's at 14 power and Crimea only has 4. The players reveal their combat power. Rusviet spent the full 7 allowed from her track, plus 5 more in combat cards for a total of 12. And then Crimea spent 0 power, but played a combat card value 2 for a total of 2. 12 to 2, Rusviet wins the combat. Rusviet spent 7 power, so we'll mark her down from 14 to 7. And Crimea didn't spend any. Crimea retreats her mech and her 3 workers back to her home base. As the loser, she'll draw a combat card. For having caused those 3 workers to retreat, Rusviet will lose 3 popularity, and she'll place a star for combat. That turn was illegal because of the way Rusviet handled the bottom row action. Top row was fine. She spent her combat card. She moved up 2 on popularity. Pretty simple. Notice the difference in how the movement icons appear on the factory card from the way they appear on the player mat. Here, they're combined. This is showing you that you can move 1 unit up to 2 times, whereas here they're distinct. So in this case, it's showing you could move 3 separate units 1 time each. When she moved those pieces down from the factory, moving 1 was fine. It was able to easily reach there. But then she couldn't activate a second piece and move it down there. Another thing I want to point out here is that it was fine that Crimea gained a combat card as the loser in this case. Sometimes people will look at this and say, well, no, she didn't spend any true power. She just threw in a combat card. But any power spent, whether it be from your power track or in the form of a combat card, counts. So even though she was 0 here, she threw in a combat card of 2. That counted as power spent to get the loser's consolation prize of a combat card. Alright, now we've come back around to Crimea's turn again, and she wants to do a bolster action, so she'll move her pawn over there and pay the 1 coin required to take that action. And she'll take the option to gain 3 power. So she'll mark those, 1, 2, 3. Then she wants to gain a popularity. So even though she's lost control of the territory with her monument, she'll go ahead and gain a popularity point. Then she announces that she's going to do a bottom row action. She's upgraded it once, so it'll cost her just 2 oil. She'll pay 2 oil from the farm space with 2 of her workers. She doesn't actually have any upgrades still available to make. She's already done all 6 of them, as you can see from the 6 cubes on the bottom row. So she'll just take the 3 coins. So she'll take a value 3 coin. We'll check around to see who gets the recruit bonus for the upgrade action. And looks like it's just Rusviet and Polania. So we'll give them each a power increase. There were a couple different things on that turn that tend to raise eyebrows, but everything was legal. One was when Crimea took that gain popularity action from having placed her monument previously. Sometimes people will assume that if you've lost control of that territory with the monument, you no longer get the benefit of the monument. But that's not the case. Once the monument is in play on the board, that action will remain available to you regardless of whether or not you continue to control the territory where it sits. That's true of the armory as well, and even the mine. When the mine's placed on a territory and an enemy occupies it, you can still travel to that territory via your mine. The one exception to that is the mill. If you lose control of the territory where the mill is, you no longer get its benefits. Which sounds like something you'd have to try to remember, that the mill is different than the rest, but there's going to be very few circumstances where you're going to want to generate resources for an enemy that's sitting in that territory. The other thing that might have looked weird on that turn is that Crimea did the upgrade action even though she had already maxed out all her upgrades. But that's perfectly fine. You can do it just for the sake of earning the coins down here. And in fact, if you've enlisted that recruit already, that becomes even more appealing to do it for coins and for that bonus. Moving on to Saxony's turn, he wants to do a trade action, so he'll move his pawn over to that column. He wants to get that armory in play before he takes his top row action, so he's going to start with his bottom row action. He's upgraded it once, so that'll cost him 3 wood. So he'll remove 3 wood from this farm that he controls. Then he'll place the armory down in this mountain space where he has a worker. We'll do a quick look around to see if anyone got a bonus for that bottom line action. Looks like Polania is the only one. So we'll give her 1 popularity. Now Saxony is ready to resolve the top row action. So he'll pay the 1 coin. Then he'll take the option to gain 2 popularity. 1, 2, and then he'll gain 1 power from the armory. That move was illegal because Saxony did the actions out of sequence. You don't necessarily have to do all the actions, but they always have to be done in a certain order. You move your pawn, you can take a top row action, you can take a bottom row action, and then if you've got an objective to complete, you can complete that. If you decide to skip the top row action and take the bottom row action instead, that's fine. But you can't take a bottom row action and then backtrack and take a top row action. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Hopefully you got most of the questions right. My next couple episodes will definitely be on the game's Dominant Species Marine and Ark Nova. I don't necessarily know the order yet. It depends on when my copy of Ark Nova arrives. Hopefully you'll join me for those, and till then, thanks for watching.